So I wanted to do this video in part because a conversation on Twitch sort of made me want to do this. I was on KnightNC's channel. If you want to check him out, I'll probably put his channel on the description of my video. Um, but it made me realize, oh hey, this control layout for DmC Devil May Cry was a bigger pain in the ass to get than my control layout for DmC 3 or DmC 4 or even DmC 5. And there are multiple reasons for this. So the first reason is because the game's controls are by default pretty trash. Because of the lack of lock-on, it makes it so that the buttons are used less efficiently. It basically makes it so that there's a lot of convoluted inputs here and there that are just convoluted because they decided not to use lock-on and they forgot other alternatives to making a good control layout. So and it ends up being a huge waste of space for a lot of things. Secondly, is that on the PC version, you cannot bind a double button input. This includes double triggering, which is by default pressing center camera and changing targets. So that's L3 and R3. You have to press them simultaneously. That's for double trigger. For gun special, you have to press both gun and jump at the same time. And the problem with that is that, well, there's multiple problems. One is that double button inputs, I just hate them. Especially if I have a different control layout where jump is on circle, let's say, and square is guns. To have your thumb press both of those buttons at the same time is going to be a pain in the ass. So, like, double button inputs are not control rebindable friendly, let's say. If you want to have a unique control layout that suits your playstyle, you're going to have to take into account double button inputs. So that's the first negative. The second negative is that in DmC Devil May Cry, you have to press them near simultaneously, whereas in DmC 4 or DmC Devil May Cry, DmC 5, I mean, you can actually hold down one of the inputs and then press the other input, and then you get the special melee. So you don't actually have to be very strenuous with your, very strict with your input. And so that's the second downfall of DmC Devil May Cry, and no pun intended. The third issue is that because it uses shoot for special melee, like inverse rainstorm, shotgun, whatever. That means that if I'm using charge shot, and if I use inverse rainstorm, I'm going to have to let go of my charge shot. And I'm going to have to then do the inputs for it. And so that means that I can't be doing charge shot while doing inverse rainstorm. Now, here's the catch. On console, you can actually bind two inputs to a single button. Basically, you tell the game, hey, instead of it requiring two inputs, I get to use just one input. And so, on Definitive Edition, on I think it's just the console version of this game, you can actually rebind it to a single button through the controls option, but you can't do that on PC. You have to go into the INI file to have that change take effect. Now, why is this an issue? The issue is that if I go into the INI file, that button is bound for both Dante and Virgil. So, like, if I bind Inverse Rainstorm Gun Special to Triangle, right? If I bind it to Triangle, it's going to be both bound for Triangle with Dante and with Virgil. I can't change the controls individually for Dante and Virgil once that's set. Because of some reasons. I'm not going to get into it. It gets a little bit complicated. It's kind of weird. Basically, if you have an input unbound in the controls, it requires you to bind that input. And sometimes there are some inputs that I just simply don't want to use, but it still forces me to bind that input. And so, like, I can't get out of the menu. If I were to go into controls right now, I would soft lock my game because I've made that INI file change. So it's again, like, you know, they didn't think really far ahead with this game when it came to inputs. And this PC port is wonderful, but when it comes to controls, they made a very piss poor job with it. Um, so, I want to have, you know, my gun special with different buttons for both Dante and Virgil. I want my gun special to be on triangle with Dante, and for Virgil, it's another button. I'll get into it in a bit, but I can't do that if I use just the INI file. Which leads me to my step 3, which is basically using the Steam controls so that I can have 2 profiles for both characters, so that one character has a different control layout than the other character. And so I can swap INI files if I want to play Virgil, but that would mean that I would have to get out of the game, swap the INI file, then go back into the game and select Virgil. And so that is a huge time waste that I don't need to do with Steam Control Layout. But it also means that getting it set up is a lot more complicated than it would with just a simple INI file swap. So my goal was this, basically. Have an INI file that applies for both Dante and Virgil for the most part, and then have Steam Control Layout do the rest of the work. And that is a lot harder than it seems, because there are a lot of conflicting inputs and stuff like that. So let's get into it. So for Dante, I have everything by default except for light melee, which is circle. Heavy melee is on square. Shoot is on L1. Gun switching is on down on the D-pad. Special gun is on triangle. And double trigger is on L3. So I'm going to go over why these are the controls that I went with. But first of all, I wanted to make sure that the control layout that I want is very similar to the control layouts that I have for DmC 3 and 4. And that's because I'm comfortable with them, but also I feel like they are, generally speaking, pretty good controller layouts overall, because it helps me achieve the things that I want. My gun on DmC 3, 4, and 5 is on L1. And I think that's applied throughout every character besides, let me think of what character it's not. Besides maybe V, which I don't play at all, really. L1 is used throughout all the characters for shoot. So that's a no-brainer. And the reason why this is important for DmC Devil May Cry is that guns being charged are super useful in this game. Charge shot is useful because it suspends enemies for a bit. For shotgun, it gives me an explosion, a second explosion. That is a very useful tool. It's basically an aerial launch that I can do many other things during that thing that is going to explode. So, and also, charge shots can give a bunch of movement. So right there I did a side switch. And I can also suck myself back in with charge shots. Now this is more so a property of Angel Boost, because Angel Boost has this property with other attacks. It's a little bit more subtle. Like right there, yeah, that's, I need to aim my analog stick back towards the enemy. But it's a property with Angel Boost. I'm getting too ahead of myself. Basically, charge shots are pretty useful because I can hold them down, and I don't really need to spam them, right? Also, like, I can cancel attacks with Ebony and Ivory and stuff, so having it on L1 is pretty useful as well. But, you know, that's the reasoning for charge shot, and as well with Virgil, the same concept. I get to shoot swords while doing other attacks. So that's a no-brainer. However, light melee and heavy melee are kind of swapped. So, like, high time would be a melee input, which would, in normal situations, would be on my circle from my other control. But it's also like a Helmbreaker input. And then Prop Shredder, you know, would be a style input, but it's on heavy melee, right? And so, like, this would be a melee attack on the ground in the other games, but this would be a style attack in the other games. Besides, I think it's DmC 5 maybe. But you know, they kind of swapped around attacks a bit here, but it's not a big issue because the JC requirements aren't very tight in this game by comparison. For some attacks they are, but like, you know, it could be a bit more lenient. And so the reason why I have heavy melee on square and light melee on circle is because they're closer to the jump button. And that allows me to JC things a bit easier. So if I'm going to do aerial rave JC, I'm going to slide my thumb from X to circle. And if you notice, a lot of light melee attacks don't change my positioning really that much. But the heavy melee attacks displace me. So this brings me down. This also brings me down. This also brings me down. This doesn't really bring me down, but so does this. So it's like they might as well be the same. This moves me forward, right? So heavy melee on circle because I have much more comfort JCing things with square than with circle. But circle is also very easy for me, so like it's basically not really that much of a difference. But for me, it's a bit easier to do things JC'd on square than on circle. And you don't want to fuck these JCs up if you are wanting to JC them, so that's why I have it on square for me, because it's a lot easier. And again, I say a lot easier as if like I somehow mess up my like sliding JCs, but that's not the case. It's pretty easy to do. And so the reason why I have gun switch on down on D-pad, this is kind of more so for future proofing, because at the moment I don't really need it. I could very well do this with up on the D-pad, but the reason it's for future proofing is because you're going to be using the analog stick a lot, and your thumb is split between the analog stick and the D-pad, okay? And so this is kind of a dilemma, because the further away a button is from the analog stick, the more time it takes to get a D-pad input and then an analog input, or vice versa. And so you want to make that gap, that speed requirement, as little as possible. And so even though down on the D-pad is closer to the analog stick, and up on the D-pad is just a little bit further, that little bit further is enough to make certain setups in DMC4 a lot harder, for example. And so I'm probably not going to be really needing to move my thumb from the analog stick to the gun switch button that fast. But again, just in case in the future I find a technique that requires a very fast switching from gun switching to, you know, moving the analog stick, that's there. It's for future proofing. The reason why I have gun special on triangle is because I much rather have it on one of the face buttons than on the D-pad, because again, the analog stick and the D-pad require the same thumb. So I get to reverse this attack, for example, and do something like, I don't know, let's see if I can do this. This is kind of tricky. See, like that. I can reverse my gun special without having to do something like claw or something, right? So like, I could have had it on down on D-pad too, and I wouldn't need to claw, because if I move my analog stick to the left side of my thumb will be able to press down on the D-pad while the right side of my thumb is still, you know, moving the analog stick. And in the inverse sense, I would slide my thumb from gun switch to right on the analog stick. But if I were to have it on up on the D-pad, that would be a whole different story. I would probably have to claw for that. But you know, I don't need to do that. I just have it on triangle. I could have probably swapped triangle with dodge, but it's not really necessary. There's no real benefit either or, it feels like. I mean, it would probably make my JCs with back with it would probably make my JCs with special gun easier if I were to put it on L1, but I could learn that easily eventually. My weakest JCs are these. Like if I were to go from X to triangle, those are things that I'm not really used to because I avoided them with DmC 3, 4, and 5 with my control layouts, and they have worked wonders for me. But in this case, I would actually need to learn that a bit better. And the good thing is that I don't really need to JC gun special that often, so it's neither here nor there. It will eventually be something that is muscle memory. Then DT is on L3. The reason it's on L3 is because, one, target switching with L3 is not necessary with this game at all. Like, there's no lock-on, so why? Like you can even delay your gunshots and move the analog stick to another enemy, and you will be able to target switch. So it's like, it's not necessary. Whereas with lock-on, you're actually locked onto an enemy, and so target switch can be useful in certain situations, but not really. Like, even then, in DmC 3, 4, and 5, using the target switch button isn't very useful. There are some niche situations in which it might be useful, but for the most part, if you're good with the game, you don't really need that target switch button. So I got rid of it entirely, and I bound it to DT, which is now a single button again. I would have put it on up on the D-pad, but the reason why I don't put it on up on the D-pad is for this stuff. Like, DT cancels everything. It's basically like SDT and DMC5 or double trigger for narrow and DMC4 and 5. You can cancel moves with DT, and you can turn it off pretty quickly as well. And the reason why I don't want to put it on up on the D-pad is that I might want to, like, for example, reverse an attack or something, or just do like a stinger, right? I maybe just want to do a stinger and then do this, right? But if I were to put it on a D-pad, it would have to mean that my thumb will move from the analog stick to the D-pad. And, you know, again, I could probably claw that. I could probably just do that normally. But if I bind it to L3, I just don't have to. So, it just makes it a bit more future-proof. And, you know, again, like if I were to put it on the D-pad, it would probably take a bit longer to get used to, but eventually I'll get used to it. So this is just for future-proofing and to make things as easy as possible for me. I'm still wondering, maybe I would put it on the D-pad, who knows. The reason why I don't really care too much about this right now is because I want to build some fundamentals with Reboot, which I'll be playing more often. But that double trigger stuff isn't very fundamental yet. That's more special. And the reason why it's not very fundamental is because building DT for this game takes an eternity, and when you DT, it takes a huge chunk of your DT bar. So, you know, I'll eventually mess around with super costumes and all of that, so that I won't have to worry about that. But for the meantime, I'll just work on something that is more fundamental and consistent throughout, whether or not I use super costume. So that is the explanation for my control layout with Dante. Now I'm going to go over the actual steps required to get this control layout working. I'm going to go over my INI file. Jump is default. Range attack is on left shoulder, which is L1. So as I said, if I do something on the INI file, it applies to both Dante and Virgil. And Dante and Virgil both use shoot on L1 for my control layout. So I just added that on the INI file so that things are easier. Light melee is on circle. Strong melee is on square. And that applies for both characters for the same reasons that I mentioned with Dante. It also applies for Virgil. Evade 1 is on right shoulder. That applies for both Dante and Virgil. Which is R1, right? But Evade 2 is on triangle. Now, the reason why it's on triangle is because Virgil actually needs Evade 2. The reason why he needs it is because if you leave the analog stick neutral, Evade 1 does one thing, and Evade 2 does another thing. So, like, if I leave the analog stick neutral, I'll either trick up or trick down depending on which Evade button I press down. So, like, this is what I mean about this game's controls not being very well optimized, they waste a ton of space. I am forced to use Evade 2 for Virgil. You know, there's no getting around that. But I'm not forced to use it with Dante, and I'll get into that in a bit. But cycle range target, I unbound it because I don't need it. It's not necessary. Again, I could just move the analog stick toward the enemy, and that would be as good as cycle range targets. Or I could just get closer to the enemy. Cycle range weapon is on D-pad down. Now, the D-pad input for cycling weapons is separate from Virgil, because Virgil has Doppelganger, and Doppelganger have their own binds, so I can actually do this on the INI file without affecting Virgil, which is a plus. Gun special, I have it on left stick. So here's the reason why I have it on left stick. If I have it on left stick, it forces the game to have shoot as the left stick input for the joystick. But for the keyboard, it forces it to have it on, I think it's C on the keyboard. That way I don't have to press two keyboard buttons at the same time. It's just bounded to C. I think it's also has its own separate bind. I don't know. I can't remember, but I'm pretty sure I have it left stick for a reason, and I think that's the reason. So the game forces those double button inputs into a single keyboard press. And that keyboard press, I transfer it over to my Steam controller configuration. So my Steam controller configuration will tell my controller that if I'm on my Dante profile, that triangle is a keyboard input, and that keyboard input is C. And that keyboard input equals special guns. Gun special, I'm sorry. Double trigger is normal. And the reason why double trigger is normal is because I'm also using a keyboard input for my controller. The keyboard input for double trigger by default is V. When I press L3 on the Steam controller configuration, I make it so that I get a keyboard input, and that keyboard input is V. I should also mention I have a binding for turbo mode, and the binding for turbo mode is F10 on my INI file. I'll get into that in a little bit, but this is basically the INI file. Okay, guys, so I'm now with Virgil, and so I'm going to go over his stuff now. So shoot L1. The reasons why I mentioned with Dante is just so it's something that I can do while doing an attack, and it's something that I have bound to virtually every character in the DmC franchise. So L1. Trick down, evade, is an R1. The reason for this is not very special. You can actually repeatedly cancel stuff with trick down like this. So having it on L1, I mean R1, feels a bit easier for me. I can actually change the time. I can adjust the timings of these things a bit easier with L1. So I can make it a bit slower if I want to, I guess, but it's a bit easier for me. Trick up is on triangle. The reason for this is like it's kind of a useful move to sometimes have as a JC, maybe. I don't know. There's no real reason. The light melee and the heavy melee are the same as Dante and DmC Don't Cry. For the same reasons, again, like it's just easier to JC depending on what I'm doing. And Doppelganger is on R3. Summon Swords formations is on L3. So here's my reasoning for those buttons. So Doppelganger is something that I'm actually kind of... I'm going to be honest with you guys. Doppelganger with Virgil in this game is intimidating as fuck. This guy has one of the most deepest doppelgangers I've ever seen. And like DmC 5 Virgil, if it allowed you to have delays per weapons, if it allowed the doppelganger to switch weapons, right? And if it allowed you to activate Doppelganger instantly, even during a move animation, he would probably be one of the deepest, if not the deepest, doppelgangers in the series. But because DMC5 Virgil doesn't do that, it misses opportunity. So I think that DMC Devil May Cry Virgil has the deepest doppelganger in the entire series. Like, you can quote me on that, honestly. Like, I'm pretty certain of this. And so it's rather intimidating, and I have it on L3 largely because like I can't do anything on a D-pad. The D-pad is pretty fine as it is. It has delays. It has sort of like making your doppelganger do certain weapons. So the D-pad is just occupied fully. It's not like Dante, whereas there's one button on the D-pad that isn't occupied. Virgil is just packed, unfortunately. And again, part of that is due to like the poor thought process of the developers when it came to the control layout. And so I have no other option than to put it on R3. And I don't really need to center camera much. I could just move the camera around. So in the instances in which I do want to center camera, like I just might as well just get good and try to avoid trying to center the camera in the first place. So that's why it's here, because it's not going to be as used. However, Gun Special is on L3. I really, 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 really wish it could be put on Triangle, but again, Triangle is this. So I am really considering maybe I could swap those two. Maybe. But the reason why I don't want to really swap them is because of this. This is done by holding this and then canceling with this. And I could actually cancel the dash with this charge move again. So they both cancel each other. And I could just do this by sliding my thumb from square, which is my heavy melee, to triangle, which is my my trick up flash evade button. And I could also do this with oh, there's a wall here. I could also do this with L1. But I don't know if I'm very consistent with that. So I'll have to look into that. Maybe I can actually just throw that away and maybe swap these two. But who knows? It doesn't matter to me really. Ultimately, I'll find a way. But the thing about this is that I can also be like doing an attack and activating this. I could probably also do that if I just had it on triangle and slid my thumb from square to triangle, but you know, the reason why I really want that button as a single button input instead of a double button input is because Virgil, when he does this, by default, that's double forward input and then jump and try and shoot at the same time. Who thought about this input? I have no idea, but man, I don't even know. I'm just gonna keep it civil, dude. Just like, think about it, dude. Just think about how bad of an input this is. And so making the double button input into a single input just makes it a lot easier. And so I just move the analog stick twice forward and then press down, and I get this. So that's my thought process behind this. And so this is where the pain comes in, because then I have like two characters sharing the same INI file. And so, with Dante, as I explained earlier, you know, I'm going to go back over this. Triangle is a keyboard input, so it's C. And triangle for Dante equals special gun. DT for Dante is on L3. And that is also keyboard input, it's a V. The rest I leave to the INI file to do with Dante. But then with Virgil, it's a little bit different. When I press down the analog stick, my left analog stick, it is C. R3 is V. And that's double trigger for Virgil. Everything else is default. The INI file does everything else. But here's another thing that I have. Remember that I said that turbo mode is on left alt and F10 as a bind? The thing about turbo mode is that it turns off whenever you enter another mission or new room, I think sometimes, or a cutscene, I can't remember, but... And so that's a pain in the ass to always go back to your keyboard, right? So the way I have it on my controller is that if I have the analog stick hit the outer edge, that is considered a separate input on the Steam configuration. So when I move the analog stick all the way to the extreme, I have it bound to left alt plus F10. That way, whenever I come into a room and move forward, automatically turbo mode gets turned on. And that's applied for both Dante and Virgil. And then ultimately, if I want to switch between these control layouts, I press on right on my touchpad, and then I swap between both of these controllers. And that is how I am able to have a single INI file and have two separate control layouts for both Dante and Virgil, while also having double button input moves onto a single button instead of having it on two buttons. So it's a pain in the ass to get, but yeah, I fucking got it after like 3 hours. Again, I feel like I may have like not explained some things very well because again, I've made these control adjustments I'd say like a month or 2 or 3 ago. I can't remember. But yeah, like now I don't have to fucking turn off the game and swap INI files if I want to play Dante or Virgil or whatever. I can just like press right on my touchpad and voila, get it all. So yeah, I apologize if a lot of this kind of is a pain in the ass to follow because I oftentimes say, like, for example, I'm talking about, oh hey, let's press L1, but then I really mean R1, and then I have to correct myself, and then it's just like me fucking rusing you guys. So, but yeah, this is how I get my analog stick. I mean, my control is working. I'm fucking shit at talking. Bye.